Oklahoma Gardening is a production of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the land grant mission of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University, dedicated to improving the quality of life of the citizens of Oklahoma through research-based information. Underwriting assistance for our program is provided by the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing. Today on Oklahoma Gardening, host Casey Hentges is at our bermudagrass eradication study to create some new plots to study the effectiveness of solarization. We learn how getting rid of some of our immature pecans can make for better harvests. OSU Turfgrass Specialist Justin Moss identifies what makes a grass. And Barbara Brown has a pasta with sausage and grapes.
We're back out here at the Cimarron Research Station to take a look at our Bermuda grass experiment that we're doing out here, trying to eliminate it from a plot area. So we want to first look at some of the plastic treatments that we've been doing out here. And you might notice that there's two different colors of plastic that we've used. We use both black plastic and clear plastic. Now I first want to talk about the black plastic that we've used here. So typically when we talk about using plastic over Bermuda grass to kill it, we're often talking about solarization, which really you want to use clear plastic for that. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But first I want to talk about why we use black plastic. And part of it was just to demonstrate the difference between clear and black. But using black plastic, that's actually a process called occultation, which is basically eliminating the light between two things. And so we're eliminating the light exposure to the ground here and to the grass and stuff. So we did two different trials under black plastic. One was tilled and one was not tilled. So this particular one was tilled, and what you can see is this black plastic has prevented really anything from germinating this spring. Now keep in mind that both of these plastics have been on since we started this process last September. So we're almost coming up on a full year that these plastics have been on these plots. So as we pull it back, you can see there is obviously Bermuda grass is rhizomatous. It's going to grow in from the edges, but the stuff that has been growing underneath the plastic, it's actually very bleached out, and this is called blanching when you've eliminated the light or you've buried the plant. So you can see the difference. This Bermuda grass was growing over the plastic and this was underneath it. So it's still going to potentially come in and grow, but we really haven't gotten the temperatures up. But what happened was that black plastic prevented anything from growing, both in the tilled area and the non-tilled area. So we never had a good stand all season long under the black plastic. Now let's shift over here to the clear plastic. You can see this plot was not tilled. You can see that there's still some vegetation, but at this point all of the upper growth is dried. Again, we still have a little bit on the sides. Now we suspect that the thickness of plastic that we used might have been too thick because it's pretty opaque, which means we're not getting enough solar light penetrating through here to really heat that up and create that greenhouse effect to kill everything. It also might have been that there's not enough moisture underneath this at a certain point as well to help steam it. It is recommended to use a clear plastic that's anywhere from 2 to 6 mil. So because 6 mil seemed to be a little more opaque than we wanted, what we're going to do is kind of repeat this process, and we're using 2 mil, which is thinner, so you might have to be more cautious about the wind and damage to create holes, because you really want to create an envelope. Now over here we've done a larger plot. This is a 10 by 10, probably more of a typical size for a garden bed. You can see how much condensation is forming on this, and this has only been here in place for 1 week at this point. So the condensation is an important factor in solarization. And again, with solarization, you're wanting to use clear plastic because the idea is that we're going to create a steam oven by capturing the solar energy. So you want as much transparency of that light going through to allow it to really heat up in there. Now, to properly solarize an area, it's very important to create that seal around the edges. So again, you're going to first water your location that you're wanting to solarize, then bury plastic all the way around the edges. You can either do this by digging in the plastic or by putting more soil on top of the edges. By sealing the envelopes, you're going to allow that condensation to really be trapped in there and trap that heat. Now again, if you don't see that condensation beginning to form or forming, then you likely don't have enough moisture in your soil. So you're going to want to pull that back, irrigate that area, and then rebury those sides. Again, making sure to seal it. Don't just put bricks along the edges leaving gaps, because that will allow that heat to escape. This condensation is actually a critical component to solarizing the soil. That's what really helps heat up this space and allows you to eliminate those nematodes, the fungus, insects, and other things that microbials that might be living in the soil causing problems on your plants. The other thing is it will also kill weed seeds potentially and the vegetation that's already existing there in that area if the temperatures reach a high enough degree. Now, right now, today, the temperature outside is about 88 degrees according to the nearby mesonet, but you can see on our thermometer that it's actually reading 102 underneath this plastic. So that just shows you on an average day the difference underneath plastic. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is, this is going to heat up this whole area, and the sun's energy, the heat, doesn't know the difference between the good guys and the bad guys. So when we remove this, after about 4 weeks, you want to do this in the heat of the season. And when we remove this, we're going to then want to put down some compost or something to work back into the soil those good bacteria.
Today we're talking about pecan crop load management. And it's kind of a strange thing to think about, actually removing some of our pecans, but it actually will benefit your tree tremendously if they're overloaded. Now, you may remember last year was a great year for pecans, and almost everyone, their pecan trees were just loaded. And many people don't have very much this year. That's probably because their trees were too busy trying to fill all those pecans, and they're not trying to produce buds for next year's crop. So in the orchard at the research station, at the Cimarron Valley Research Station, we maintain a block of Pawnee trees and Kanza and Merrimack. And so in the first week of August is normally the time that we do our crop load management. In a commercial orchard, they would use a trunk shaker like they would use for harvesting the pecans, shaking the trees. But you can also do some crop load thinning in your yard. We can use a frailing pole just to remove some of those nuts. Why would we want to take off any pecans? Most people want as many as they can get. It actually is going to help our tree produce better quality pecans and better sized pecans. You think about each one of these nuts requires 8 to 10 leaves to fill out properly. When we have a tree that's completely loaded with pecans, then there's not enough leaves to provide the photosynthesis to make the carbohydrates to fill those nuts. And so we will benefit this tree by removing part of that crop. We also help the tree out by they go into the winter with less potential for freeze injury. They're stressed because they're trying to fill out all these pecans, and so if we can have them in a happy state going into the winter, then they're going to be much better off. We can also have some issues with shuck decline and some other ripening issues if we have too many pecans on the tree as well. The main benefit, though, is that reduces the alternate bearing, where we have one year a huge crop and nothing the next year. And so that's why we recommend, if you've got a tree that you can reach with maybe a frailing pole and get out there and remove some of those nuts when the pecans are in the water stage, and that means when you cut them open, they're filled with liquid endosperm. They haven't started actually making the kernel material, but it's the process right before it goes into that dough stage, and that's when we we lose the benefit of thinning after that dough stage. So we want to thin them when they're in the water stage. And so I'm going to grab a pole over here and I'll show you just how we might look about doing this. Now, I'm not the best at using a frailing pole. They're awfully long and difficult to maneuver. But if you look up in this tree, you might see that almost every one of our terminal shoots has a cluster. And it doesn't matter if there's one nut or if there's 7 nuts in that cluster, it's still counted as a cluster on a shoot. So we want to have about 50% of those shoots with clusters on these large fruited pecans. Now, if they're smaller, you can leave more on the tree. It's not as hard to fill out properly. But I'm going to just see if we can knock off a few with my frailing pole. So after you've got your crop load to about 50% of the terminal branches with pecans, then you can stop. And so those nuts on the ground can be raked up and tossed in the trash. They're just mainly water, so they'll dry up. But for more information on crop load thinning, we have a fact sheet you can find at the Oklahoma Pecan Management webpage. It's okpecans.okstate.edu, or you can go to factsheets.okstate.edu and search for pecan crop management.
So what makes a grass a grass? So here we are with a bunch of beautiful turf grasses and ornamental grasses, and then there's a lot of plants that look like grasses but actually are not. So how would we look at these and ID these to know if it's actually grass? Well, what we do as horticulturalists and turf scientists and landscape managers is we'll take a look at some specific features of the plant, and that'll help us to know, okay, is this a grass or not? But also it'll help us to know which species are we dealing with. And so basically what we do is we'll go out to the field or wherever we're working, and when we're trying to ID something, we'll just take a sample. And the nice thing about that is you got the plant in your hand, you can take a look at it. The bad thing about it is sometimes it's very small and hard to see. So often what we'll do is we'll magnify it up, take a look with magnification so that we can see these features. So one of the first things that we'll actually look for, I'll back up a second, and we'll just kind of look at the landscape itself. And so sometimes we can see maybe different shades. And so I'm standing in an area right here where I actually see 3 different shades of grass. One's a little darker green, one's a little lighter green, and then one's even more darker green back here, and they all have different textures. So when we talk about maybe the leaf itself, we define that in terms of a texture. So if we have a very skinny leaf blade, we'll say it has a fine texture. If we have a more wide or fat leaf blade, we'll say it has a coarse texture. So we can see here, just right here where I'm standing, differences from a medium to a fine to a coarse textured grass here. So that can help us to know, okay, which direction should I go then? The other thing we can look at, just looking at the field here, is are there any inflorescence, or an easier word for that or term for that is a seed head. So we can look around and try to find out, are there any seed heads here? And so there actually are, and I can pull up a bermudagrass seed head, and I can see it comes up and has 3 or 4 or 5 little fingers sticking out. Or if I had a zoysia grass seed head, it would just be a single spike sticking up out of the ground. Or if I had maybe like a Kentucky bluegrass seed head, it wouldn't look more, it would be a panicle and be more like a triangle with flowers sticking out from it. So that can definitely help us. Okay, so let's get a little bit closer and magnify and look at this. So I have a bermudagrass sample in my hand, and so after I'm looking at the texture, the seed heads or inflorescence, I'll take a closer look at my sample, and I'll just kind of peel a leaf back and take a look at the junction where there's a stem coming up. And then if I pull the leaf back, I'll notice as it pulls back, it has a sheath or covering. And that sheath or covering covers the stem, and as I pull it back, that sheath or covering comes off. And then I can look at that junction there, and I can look for specific features like a ligule. So a ligule could be right there at that junction where I pull the leaf sheath back from the stem, and I point it up and take a look, and I may see some hairs there. So a lot of times on Bermuda grass, you'll see a fringe of hairs for the ligule. There's other grasses that you actually see what looks like a little piece of skin, and we'll say that's a membranous ligule. Okay, so the other thing I do is where I pulled that back is look at actually the back side of the leaf, and just like my shirt here has a collar on it, I can look at the back side of that leaf and look for the collar. And sometimes that could be really nothing there, just nothing to see, or you could see maybe a broad area of meristematic tissue, which makes it look maybe white and very broad, and we'll say it has a broad collar or something like that, or you may not see anything, but that can help us to ID. So for Bermuda grass, you don't see a whole lot on the collar area. Okay, so now if I just look at the leaf itself, I was talking about the leaf texture. So this is kind of a skinny or fine leaf texture, but also I can look at, are there veins running up and down the leaves? Is it veinous or not? And then can I look at the leaf tip? Does it come to a point, or is it rounded, or is it blunt, or does it look like the bow of a boat? So that can really help me. For Bermuda grass, it's going to be usually a pointed leaf tip, but if I'm dealing with the bluegrass, it's going to look like the bow of a boat. So that can really help us to differentiate. So the other thing I can do is actually, if I were to take this stem here and just take a straight edge and just chop that stem right in half, and then I take turn it towards myself and look down it like I'm looking down a barrel or something like that, I can actually see something called vernation. And so sometimes it's the way that basically these stems in the plant itself grows up as a stem. And sometimes that's more flattened or folded is what we'll call it. And sometimes it's more round like a roll of paper towels or rolled. And so you can look and see, does my grass have a folded vernation or a rolled vernation? And actually that sometimes can help you, say like with a Bermuda grass versus a zoysia grass where one has folded and one is rolled. All difficult things to master, but once you kind of do it a time or two, it becomes quite easier. The other thing we have at Oklahoma State University is we have actually courses to help you ID grasses, not just for the students here at Stillwater, but also for the public. So we have county extension offices where they can help you ID these grasses. But what's nice about it, get some of these tools in your toolbox, you can go out, impress your friends, impress your husband or wife and say, hey, I know what this is, and I know how the ID features are for grasses.
Today we're doing red grapes and sausage pasta. Now you may be wondering, grapes? And what I'm trying to do is show you that even though we often use tomatoes as the vegetable fruit that goes in a sauce, you can use other kinds of fruits as well. And in the summertime, grapes are as often as abundant as tomatoes. So we're going to substitute out the tomatoes and put in red grapes instead, using seedless grapes to make it a little bit easier. Get started, I've got 6 ounces of sweet Italian sausage. You could use a spicier type of Italian sausage if you chose. I'm using a sweet variety. If it comes in a casing, make sure you take it out of the casing first. Put it over medium heat in a large skillet and let it come to brown. And you want it to get nice and brown. So this may take you 10 to 15 minutes. It's on medium heat, nothing high. So give it plenty of time. And then we're going to drain the fat away by moving it to a paper towel lined plate, and we'll move on from there. Once your sausage is browned, again, you want to drain any excess fat away from it, but don't worry about cleaning out the pan too much. If you wanted to, you could put a little bit of wine or something in there and clean that off, but we're going to do some more cooking in there. So most of this is going to get scraped up as we go. This is going to sit, so make sure that it's completely cooked. You're not going to cook it further later on. So let me get the burner back on. And I'm going to add to it about a tablespoon of olive oil. You could use another kind of oil if you chose. I just have that one and I like the flavor of it. So here we're looking for a good flavor. And then I've got a small onion or half of a medium onion sliced fairly thin. I'm using a red onion. It makes a good color in here. And then I'm adding some fennel. And add about the same amount of fennel that you added onion. So this is about 1 fennel bulb, and it was a half of a medium onion in order to get what I've got in the pan as we're going. The fennel is got the same flavor as the Italian sausage because the Italian sausage has fennel seed in it. So if you don't want to use the fennel or you can't find the fennel, you're not growing it, you can leave it out. You could also even add some celery to it if you chose to. Also going to add to it 2 cloves of chopped up garlic and 1/4 of a teaspoon of kosher salt. I'm going to go a little bit light on that. We can always add some more in later. We're going to stir this around, and we're just going to let this start to soften up a little bit. And then we're going to add a few more things to it and let it cook a little while. Okay, we're going to add a cup of lower sodium chicken broth. And this is what's going to get the rest of those bits off the bottom, or the fond off the bottom of the pan. And then I'm going to add 2 cups of seedless red grapes that we have obviously washed and removed the stems for. Try to get seedless though, otherwise it can be a chore to eat this. So there's that, and then 1/4 of a teaspoon or more, depending on how much you like spicy things, of red chili flakes. And we're going to let this come to a boil. Then we're going to turn it down a little bit, and it's going to simmer for about 10 to 14 minutes. The goal here, the grapes are going to burst and kind of some of their juices are going to come out into the sauce. And it's nice if the sauce thickens up a little bit as we go. Now, since this has got some time to cook, this is a good time to put some pasta on to cook. You can already have the water going. I only have one element here, so we couldn't do them simultaneously. But if I was home, I'd have the big pot of hot water going, get the pasta in it so that it can cook according to the package directions. Add a minimal amount of salt because we're going to add salt to here. We're going to add some Parmesan cheese. We've already added some salt to it. A little bit of salt, though, is important to help flavor that pasta. Otherwise, you just don't get the goodness from the pasta. But if you add too much, you can't use the pasta water later. So sometimes people will say it should taste like the ocean. And my memory isn't good enough to know exactly how that is. So 1 to 2 teaspoons of salt in the pasta water is probably enough to infuse some flavor into the pasta itself and still keep the sodium content of the water low enough that if you wanted to use some of that pasta water to thin a sauce or to make it a little bit add a little bit of starch to it because of the starch that comes out of the pasta as it cooks, you can still do so without over salting the dish. So we'll give this some time, remove some nature from it, and we'll come back in a couple of minutes. Okay, you can see that the grapes have split open and the sauce is concentrating, and that's what you're looking for. You just get it down, so if yours isn't going at the speed you want, you might turn the heat up a little bit, but you probably are going to want to stir it a little bit more often. Then we're going to put our sausage back into the pan. Now, how much you break up the sausage is totally up to you as you're cooking it. If you want bigger chunks, that's perfectly fine. Stir that together. I'm going to stop the heat on the pan. And then the next step is to stir in the pasta after we get those stirred together, and we're just about ready for dinner. So I have chosen a pasta that's got a fair amount of shape to hold the sauce. And there, we're just about finished. I'm going to sprinkle it with a little bit of black pepper, and this is optional. You can do it or not, or you may want to taste it, or you may want to pass it around. And then a little bit of grated Parmesan or shredded Parmesan. And again, pass that around the table if folks want more. And then some chopped basil. And this you don't want to put in while it's cooking because it doesn't look near as pretty and it doesn't give you the same amount of flavor. So there you go. I hope you'll give this one a try. It's something a little bit different than what we usually do during the summer, replacing tomatoes with another fruit. So give it a try. It's red grapes and sausage pasta. For Oklahoma Gardening, I'm Barbara Brown.
Next week, we'll travel to Scissortail Park in Oklahoma City to look at how they are creating an urban forest and raising bees for pollination, honey, and education. We'll study monarch generations and look at one more type of ornamental grass that you probably already have underfoot. We wish you health and wellness, and we'll see you next week for more Oklahoma Gardening. To find out more information about show topics, as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure and visit our website, oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. And we always have great information, answers to questions, photos, and gardening discussions on your favorite social media as well. Join in on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows, as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater jewel. We would like to thank our generous underwriter, the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is also provided by Pond Pro Shop, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, the Oklahoma Horticultural Society, and the Tulsa Garden Club.